Arthur stared at the chipped paint on his kitchen ceiling, waiting for the whistle of the kettle. It was 6:30 a.m., the same time he had woken up every Saturday for the last 12 years. He lived his life by a set of invisible rules. Don't waste money. Don't buy what you can't use. And never let a person get close enough to leave a mark. People called him steady, but if he were being honest with himself, he was just tired. He dressed in his usual denim work shirt and headed out the door. The morning air was crisp, smelling of damp pavement and the coming autumn. He wasn't looking for a miracle today. He just needed a sturdy wrench and maybe some plywood for the shelving in his shed. He drove his old truck toward the outskirts of town, where the houses grew larger, but the yards looked neglected. The estate sale was at a Victorian-style house that had seen better days. It belonged to a man who had passed away without much fanfare, leaving behind 70 years of accumulated stuff. As Arthur walked up the gravel driveway, he saw the usual crowd, antique flippers, looking for a quick buck, and neighbors whispering about how much the house would eventually sell for. Arthur ignored them. He liked things that were broken because they didn't ask for much, just a bit of grease and some patience. He spent an hour in the garage, sorting through rusted bins. He found a few tools, but nothing that felt right. He was about to leave when he spotted something tucked behind a stack of water-damaged cardboard boxes. It was under a heavy workbench, caked in a layer of fine gray dust. He knelt, his knees popping in the quiet of the garage. He pulled the object out. It was a suitcase, but not the kind you see in modern airports. This was made of thick, dark leather that had turned a muddy brown over time. It had heavy brass latches and a handle that felt surprisingly solid in his hand. It was heavy to be empty, that old thing. A voice rasped. Arthur looked up to see the man running the sale. He looked like he wanted to be anywhere else. $50, the man said, leaning against the doorframe. Arthur shook his head, his instinct for a bargain kicking in. It's covered in mold, and the leather is cracking. I'll give you $5. I just need it to store my socket sets. The man waved a hand dismissively. $5. Take it. It's been sitting there since the Eisenhower administration. I don't even have the key for it. Okay. Arthur handed over a crumpled $5 bill. He lugged the suitcase to his truck, feeling the weight shift inside. Something metallic clunked against the side. It didn't sound like clothes. It sounded like a life packed away and forgotten. As he drove home, the suitcase sat on the passenger seat. For the first time in a long time, Arthur felt a flicker of curiosity. He told himself it was just a curiosity about the hardware. But as he glanced at the scarred leather, he wondered about the hands that had carried it. Who had held that handle? Where had they been going? When he reached his driveway, he didn't go to the garage. Instead, he carried the suitcase into his kitchen. He cleared off the table, moving his salt shaker into morning's newspaper. He set the suitcase down. The smell hit him then, not just dust, but something faint and floral, like dried lavender mixed with old paper. He grabbed a flathead screwdriver from his pocket. He knew he shouldn't force it, but the urge to see what was inside was becoming an itch he couldn't ignore. He wedged the tool into the right-hand latch. He felt the resistance of years of oxidation. He pushed, gritting his teeth until snap. The first latch flew open. Arthur paused. His heart was thumping in his chest, a sensation he usually only felt after climbing too many stairs. He moved to the second latch. This one was more stubborn. He had to lean his weight into it. With a loud, metallic groan, the second latch gave way. Arthur took a deep breath. He expected to find old rags, or maybe some moldy books. He placed his hands on the lid. The leather felt cool and slightly tacky. Slowly, he lifted the cover. The first thing he saw wasn't an object, but a photograph taped to the inside of the lid. It was a picture of a young man in a uniform, standing in front of a train station. He was smiling, but his eyes looked like they were searching for someone just out of the frame. Arthur reached in, his fingers brushing against a stack of envelopes. His plan to use this for tools was suddenly gone. He felt like he had just broken into someone's private sanctuary. He sat down in his wooden chair, the suitcase open before him like an unread book. and for the first time in years, Arthur forgot about his rules. Arthur sat at his kitchen table, the silence of the house feeling heavier than usual. The suitcase sat open before him, a gaping mouth of history. He had intended to just empty it out, throw away the trash, and keep the shell. But his hands wouldn't move toward the garbage bin. Instead, he reached for the first bundle of letters. They were tied together with a piece of blue ribbon that had faded so much it was almost gray. The knot was tight. A knot tied by someone who didn't want these papers to fly away. He picked at the ribbon with his calloused fingers. Arthur was a man who spent his days fixing engines and plumbing, dealing with hard steel and cold water. This ribbon felt dangerously fragile under his touch. When the knot finally gave way, the letters spilled across the table like a deck of cards. The paper was Thinonian skin paper, yellowed at the edges and smelling of a time before computers, before cell phones, before everything became instant and disposable. He picked up an envelope. The handwriting was slanted and elegant, written with a fountain pen that had bled slightly into the fibers of the paper. It was addressed to a woman named Clara. Arthur felt a strange pinch in his chest. He didn't know a Clara, but the way her name was written with a certain flourish on the C made it clear that the person writing it had loved saying her name out loud. He pulled out the letter. It was dated July 14th, 1944. "My dearest Clara," it began. Arthur felt like a peeping Tom looking into a window he had no business being near, but the words pulled him in. The writer wasn't talking about grand battles or heroes. He was talking about the mud. He was talking about how he missed the way the floorboards creaked in her father's hallway. He was talking about a dream he had where they were sitting on a porch swing, drinking lemonade that was too tart. Arthur looked around his own kitchen. It was functional. It was clean. But it was empty. He hadn't had a conversation about lemonade or creaky floorboards in years. He lived in the present, but his present was a very lonely place. He looked back at the letter. The writer, his name was Elias. As signed at the bottom, was in the middle of a war, surrounded by death and noise. Yet his mind was focused on the smell of Clara's hair. Arthur set the letter down and reached back into the suitcase. Beneath the letters, he found a small wooden box. It was a simple thing, maybe a cigar box once, but it had been sanded down. Inside was a pressed wildflower. It was flattened and colorless now, a ghost of a plant, but it was held between two pieces of wax paper. There was a note attached, from the field behind the barracks. "I wish I could send the whole meadow." A lump formed in Arthur's throat. He wasn't a man who cried. He hadn't cried when his own father passed away, mostly because he had been too busy coordinating the funeral and the estate. He had been practical then, just as he tried to be now. But this flower, this useless, dead piece of nature, felt more valuable than any tool in his garage. It represented a moment of beauty captured in the middle of a nightmare. He dug deeper. His hand hit something cold and hard. He pulled it out. It was a heavy silver watch. The glass cracked across the face like a spiderweb. The hands were frozen at 4:12. Arthur held it to his ear, knowing it wouldn't tick, but hoping for a heartbeat anyway. It was silent. He wondered if 4:12 was the moment everything changed for Elias. Was it the moment he was hurt? Or was it just the moment the watch hit the ground? As Arthur explored the suitcase, the morning sun began to move across the kitchen floor. He lost track of time. He found a map with hand-drawn circles around small towns in France. He found a recipe for apple pie written on the back of a telegram. He found a lock of hair wrapped in tissue paper. Each item was a piece of a puzzle. He began to realize that this suitcase wasn't just storage, it was a life raft. Elias had packed these things to remind himself that he was a human being, not just a number in a uniform. He had kept these things to stay tethered to the world he wanted to go back to. Arthur thought about his own suitcase. If someone opened his life right now, what would they find? A bunch of receipts? A manual for a lawnmower? A spare set of keys to a house no one visited? The realization hit him like a physical blow. He had been so busy being practical that he had forgotten to be sentimental. He had spent his whole life making sure things worked. But he hadn't made sure that his life mattered. He reached the bottom of the suitcase. There was a thick envelope sealed with red wax. It looked different from the others. It wasn't worn or handled as much. On the front, in shaky handwriting, it said, "To be opened only if I don't make it back." Arthur's hand trembled. He looked at the photograph of the young man on the lid. Elias looked so full of life, so sure that he would see Clara again. Arthur looked at the red wax. It was unbroken. This meant the letter had never been read by the person it was intended for. Or maybe it meant it had been returned to Ilias's family after Arthur couldn't finish the thought. He felt a sudden, fierce protectiveness over these items. This wasn't junk. This was a sacred trust. He realized he couldn't just keep this suitcase in his garage. He couldn't let Elias's words stay trapped in the dark for another 50 years. He stood up, his legs stiff from sitting so long. He looked at the mess of history on his table. He didn't see $5 worth of leather and paper. He saw a man's soul. And for the first time in a decade, Arthur felt a spark of purpose. He wasn't going to fix a shelf today. He was going to find out what happened to Clara. He was going to find out if there was anyone left who remembered the man who wanted to send a whole meadow in an envelope. Arthur couldn't sleep. The suitcase stayed open on the kitchen table, and even though the sun had gone down hours ago, he felt like the items inside were glowing with a light of their own. He paced his small living room, his footsteps echoing on the hardwood. Usually, the silence of his home was a comfort to him. It meant no one was asking him for anything. It meant he was in control. But tonight, the silence felt empty, like a void that Elias's letters were trying to fill. He went back to the kitchen and sat down. He picked up the thick envelope sealed with red wax. He ran his thumb over the seal. It was cold and hard. He knew that if he opened this, there was no going back. He would be stepping fully into the life of a stranger. But he also knew he couldn't just leave it sealed. A letter like this was meant to be heard. It was a voice calling out from the fog of the past, and Arthur was the only one left to listen. He didn't use a knife. He used his fingers, carefully prying the wax away from the paper. It cracked with a sharp sound that seemed loud in the quiet house. Inside was a long letter, several pages deep, written on the same thin paper as the others. But the tone was different. This wasn't a letter about dreams or lemonade. This was a letter about the end. If you were reading this, the letter began, "It means I didn't get to tell you these things myself. It means the world had other plans for me. But Clara, I want you to know that I am not afraid. Because I have known you, I have known what it means to be alive." Arthur felt a lump in his throat that he couldn't swallow. He read about Elias's deepest regrets. Elias wrote about a brother he had argued with before he shipped out a brother named Thomas. They had fought over something stupid, something about a piece of land or a debt, and they hadn't spoken since. Elias begged Clara to find Thomas and tell him that the anger was gone. He didn't want to leave the world with a broken bridge behind him. Arthur stopped reading. He looked at the wall, but he wasn't seeing his kitchen. He was seeing his own life. He had a brother, too. His brother lived only 3 towns away, but they hadn't spoken in 6 years. It had started over a disagreement about their mother's will, a small argument that grew into a mountain of pride. Arthur had always told himself that he didn't need his brother. He told himself that being alone was easier. But reading Elias's words, he realized that pride was just a fancy word for being too scared to say "I'm sorry." The next morning, Arthur didn't go to the hardware store. He went to the local library. He wasn't very good with computers, but he knew how to ask for help. He told the librarian he was looking for information on a man who lived in the area in the 1940s. He showed her the name, Elias, and the return address on one of the envelopes. The librarian, a woman with kind eyes and silver hair, seemed moved by Arthur's mission. "We don't get many people looking for history like this anymore," she whispered. They spent hours looking through old property records and digitized newspapers. Arthur felt a strange rush of adrenaline. It was like he was a detective, but instead of solving a crime, he was trying to save a memory. They found a mention of Elias in a 1946 edition of the local paper. It wasn't a happy announcement. It was a small notice stating that his effects had been returned to his family. He had died just weeks before the war ended. Arthur felt a wave of grief wash over him, which was strange because he had never met the man. But through the letters, He felt like he knew Elias better than he knew most of his living neighbors. "What about Clara?" Arthur asked, his voice cracking. The librarian searched again. After a long time, she found a marriage announcement from 1952. Clara had married a man named George. Arthur felt a momentary pang of jealousy for Elias, but then he felt a sense of relief. Clara had moved on. She had lived her life. But then he saw another notice in obituary from 5 years ago. Clara was gone too. Arthur sat back in the hard library chair. He felt like he was too late. The story was over. The suitcase had waited too long to be found. But as he looked at the screen, the librarian pointed to a name in the list of survivors. "She had a daughter," the librarian said. "And that daughter has a son who still lives in the county." The legacy wasn't dead. It had just been misplaced. He wrote down the address of the grandson. It was a farm on the north side of the county. He thanked the librarian and walked out into the bright afternoon sun. For the first time in years, Arthur didn't feel like a man who was just waiting for time to pass. He felt like a man with a job to do. He drove home and looked at the suitcase. He spent the evening carefully repacking it. He put the letters back in their bundles, but he left the blue ribbon loose so they would be easy to read. He polished the silver watch until it shone, even if it wouldn't tick. He felt a deep sense of responsibility. These items weren't his, but they had been given to him for a reason. He thought about the letter to Thomas, the brother Elias never got to reconcile with. Arthur knew what he had to do. He picked up his phone. His hand was shaking so hard he almost dropped it. He scrolled through his contacts until he found the name he hadn't called in half a decade. He didn't call yet. He told himself he would do it after he delivered the suitcase. He needed to prove to himself that he could finish what Elias started. He went to bed that night, but he didn't sleep much. He kept thinking about the look on the grandson's face when he saw what his grandfather had carried through the war. The next morning, Arthur loaded the suitcase into the front seat of his truck. He buckled the seatbelt around it, treating it with more care than he treated himself. As he drove toward the farm, the landscape changed. The houses got smaller and the fields got wider. He felt a sense of peace. He realized that the suitcase hadn't just changed his heart. It had opened his eyes. He saw the beauty in the trees, the way the light hit the barns, the way the world seemed to be breathing. He pulled into a long gravel driveway. A young man was out by a tractor wiping grease from his hands. He looked up as Arthur's truck approached. Arthur turned off the engine and sat there for a second. He took a deep breath. He grabbed the handle of the old leather suitcase and stepped out into the dust. The young man walked toward him, looking confused but not unkind. "Can I help you?" he asked. Arthur held up the suitcase. "I think I have something that belongs to you," he said. His voice was steady now. He wasn't the man who had gone to the estate sale looking for cheap tools. He was a messenger. And as he began to tell the story of Elias and the suitcase from the workbench, Arthur felt the last of the ice around his heart finally begin to melt away. He realized that every life leaves a mark, and even the smallest items a pressed flower, a broken watch, a faded letter carry the weight of a soul. He wasn't just giving back a suitcase. He was making sure that Elias's love finally found its way home. The young man by the tractor was named David. He had the same jawline as the boy in the photograph. Though his face was weathered by the sun and the hard work of the farm, he looked at the suitcase in Arthur's hand with a mix of confusion and caution. Arthur stood there, the gravel crunching under his boots, feeling the weight of the leather handle. It wasn't just a physical weight anymore. It was the weight of a secret that had been kept in the dark for far too long. Arthur began to speak, his voice a little rusty at first because he wasn't used to telling stories. He told David about the estate sale, the dusty workbench, and the $5 price tag. He watched David's expression shift from suspicion to a deep, quiet curiosity. They walked over to a wooden bench near the barn. Arthur set the suitcase down between them. The sun was high now, warming the wood and making the brass latches on the suitcase glint. When Arthur popped the latches open, the sound seemed to echo across the open field. David leaned in, his breath catching as he saw the bundles of letters and the old cracked watch. Arthur didn't just hand them over. He told David about the letters he had read. He told him about the dreams of the garden, the smell of the hair of a woman named Clara, and the way a young man in the middle of a war tried to hold on to his humanity with a pressed flower and a piece of blue. Ribbon. David reached out, his fingers trembling slightly as he touched the silver watch. He told Arthur that his grandmother, Clara, had rarely spoken about the war. She had married a good man, a man who loved her dearly, but there was always a small part of her that seemed to be looking at the horizon, waiting for something that never arrived. David realized now that she was waiting for this, not necessarily for the man, but for the closure. She had lived her life with a hole in her heart, never knowing the depth of the words Elias had written in those final days. David picked up a letter and began to read it silently. Arthur watched the young man's eyes move across the page, and he saw the moment the words hit home. David's shoulders slumped, and he let out a long, shaky sigh. For the next few hours, the two men sat on that bench. They weren't strangers anymore. They were two people connected by a ghost. David shared stories of his grandmother, how she loved to bake apple pies, the very same recipe Arthur had found in the suitcase, and how she always kept a small garden of wildflowers behind the house. It was as if the suitcase was a key that unlocked a door David didn't even know was there. He thanked Arthur over and over, his voice thick with emotion. He told Arthur that this was the greatest gift his family had ever received. But as Arthur listened to David's gratitude, he felt a sharp pang of guilt. He thought about the letter to Thomas, the brother Elias had wanted to reconcile with. He realized that while he had brought peace to Clara's family, he was still carrying his own war inside. Arthur left the farm as the shadows were beginning to stretch across the road. He drove slowly, the passenger seat feeling strangely empty without the suitcase. He felt lighter, yet there was a lingering ache in his chest. He kept thinking about Elias's plea to find his brother. He kept thinking about his own brother, whose name he hadn't spoken aloud in years. He realized that life was incredibly fragile. Elias had died wanting to say I'm sorry, and he never got the chance. Arthur was still breathing. He still had a phone. He still had a truck that could drive 3 towns over. The excuses he had made for 6 years that he was too busy, that his brother was the one who started it, that it didn't matter now seemed like thin, pathetic lies. When he got back to his silent house, Arthur didn't go to the kitchen. He went to his bedroom and sat on the edge of his bed. He looked at the old rotary phone on his nightstand, a relic he refused to replace because it still worked. He picked up the receiver and listened to the dial tone. It sounded like a heartbeat. He dialed the first 3 numbers of his brother's house, then hung up. His heart was racing. He felt like a coward. He was a man who could face a broken engine or a leaking roof without blinking. But the idea of hearing his brother's voice made his hands shake. He walked to the window and looked out at the street. He saw a neighbor walking a dog, a car driving by, a bird landing on a fence. The world was moving on, and he was stuck in a prison of his own making. He thought back to the red wax seal on Elias's final letter. That seal had stayed unbroken for decades because a life was cut short. Arthur realized that every day he didn't call his brother was a day he was choosing to keep his own heart sealed shut. He wasn't dead, but he wasn't fully alive either. He walked back to the phone. He didn't let himself think this time. He just dialed the numbers from memory, his fingers moving as if they had a mind of their own. The phone rang once, twice, 3 times. Arthur was about to hang up, his heart sinking with a mix of relief and disappointment when someone picked up. "Hello?" a voice said. It was a man's voice, a little deeper than Arthur remembered, a little more tired. Arthur opened his mouth, but no sound came out. He felt like the air had been sucked out of the room. "Hello? Is anyone there?" the voice asked again. "It's me," Arthur finally whispered. "It's Arthur." There was a long, heavy silence on the other end of the line. Arthur could hear his brother's breathing. He expected anger. He expected the phone to click shut. He expected a list of grievances. Instead, after what felt like an eternity, his brother spoke 2 words that broke Arthur's world apart. "About time," his brother said, and his voice wasn't filled with hate. It was filled with a sadness that mirrored Arthur's own. They didn't talk for long. They didn't solve the problems of the last 6 years in one phone call, but they agreed to meet for coffee the following morning at a small diner halfway between their homes. When Arthur hung up the phone, he sat in the dark for a long time. He felt a warmth spreading through his chest, a feeling he hadn't experienced since he was a young man. He looked toward the kitchen, where the suitcase had sat just 24 hours ago. He realized that the $5 he had spent at the estate sale hadn't bought him a storage box for tools. It had bought him his life back. He had gone looking for something practical, and he had found something eternal. The old leather suitcase was gone, but the change it had sparked in his heart was only just beginning. Arthur woke up before the alarm went off. For the first time in years, the morning didn't feel like a mountain he had to climb. He walked into his kitchen and looked at the table. The space where the suitcase had sat for the last few days was empty, but the wood seemed to hold a different energy. He made his coffee, moving slowly, thinking about the drive ahead. He wasn't going to a sale, and he wasn't going to work. He was going to see his brother, Leo. The drive to the diner took 40 minutes. Arthur spent the whole time rehearsing what he would say. He thought about apologizing for the things he said during that final argument over their father's old land. He thought about explaining why he had stayed away so long. But as he pulled into the parking lot of the small blue-shingled diner, he realized that words weren't the most important part. Showing up was... He saw a silver car parked near the entrance, Leo's car. It was newer than Arthur's truck, but it had the same dent in the rear bumper from a minor accident they had both joked about 10 years ago. Arthur stepped inside. The air was thick with the smell of fried eggs and cheap coffee. He spotted Leo sitting in a corner booth, staring into a white ceramic mug. Leo looked older. His hair was almost entirely white now, and his hands resting on the table looked thin. Arthur felt a sudden sharp pang of regret. How many mornings had he wasted being angry while his brother grew old without him? He walked over and slid into the booth opposite him. For a long minute, neither man spoke. They just looked at each other, seeing the ghosts of the boys they used to be.
Yeah?
You look like hell. Arthur, Leo said, but there was a small, watery smile on his face. You're not exactly a movie star yourself, Arthur replied. The tension broke. They didn't dive into the big issues right away. They talked about the weather, about the diner's famous blueberry pancakes, and about the aches and pains that come with age. But eventually the conversation slowed and Arthur reached into his pocket. He hadn't brought the suitcase, but he had brought something else. He pulled out a small folded piece of paper, a copy of the letter Elias had written to his own brother Thomas. Arthur handed it across the table. I found this in an old suitcase, he explained. It was written by a man who died in the war. He never got to talk to his brother again. He spent his last moments wishing he could take back a fight they had. Leo read the letter slowly. His eyes moved back and forth, and Arthur watched as his brother's face softened. When Leo finished, he set the paper down and looked out the window. We've been fools, haven't we? Leo whispered. Arthur nodded. He didn't need to say anything else. The letter from a stranger who had been gone for 80 years had done the work for them. It had shown them that life is too short to spend it holding on to heavy things that don't matter. They stayed at the diner until the lunch. Crowd started to thin out. By the time they walked out to the parking lot, the air felt warmer. Leo reached out and hugged Arthur, a clumsy, stiff hug, but a real one. They promised to meet again next Sunday, not at a diner, but at the old family house. As Arthur drove away, he looked in his rearview mirror and saw Leo waving. He felt a sense of completion, like a circle that had been broken for a long time was finally being closed. When Arthur got back to his house, he didn't feel the need to hide in his garage. He went to his backyard instead. It was a patch of weeds and overgrown grass that he had neglected for seasons. He looked at the soil and thought about Elias's dream of a garden. He thought about the wildflower pressed between the wax paper. He went to his shed, grabbed a shovel, and began to turn the earth. He wasn't fixing a shelf or repairing a tool. He was preparing a place for something to grow. As he worked, his neighbors passed by. Some of them waved, surprised to see the cranky old man out in the sun. Arthur waved back. He felt a connection to the world that he had forgotten existed. He realized that the suitcase hadn't just been a container for letters and photos. It was a vessel for a message that had traveled through time to find him. It had reminded him that we are all just carrying around our stories, waiting for someone to listen. By sunset, Arthur was tired, his back aching in a way that felt good. He sat on his back porch and watched the stars begin to appear. He thought about Elias and Clara, and the grandson, David, who was now holding on to their history. He thought about Leo, who was probably sitting in his own kitchen, thinking about the letter. Arthur realized that he was no longer just a man who lived by rules and logic. He was a man who understood the value of a memory. He went inside and looked at the empty spot on the kitchen table one last time. He didn't miss the suitcase. He didn't need it anymore. The contents were where they belonged, in the hands of people who loved the man who owned them. And the lesson the suitcase carried was now firmly planted in Arthur's heart. He picked up his pen and a piece of paper. He didn't write a list of chores or a budget. He started a letter to his brother, telling him about the garden he was planting. The house wasn't silent anymore. It was filled with the sound of a heart that had finally decided to open up. One look inside a $5 suitcase had changed everything. It had turned a collector of junk into a keeper of legacies. Arthur smiled, closed his eyes, and for the first time in many years, he slept with a mind that was at peace and a heart that was full. The weeks that followed the delivery of the suitcase felt like a slow, beautiful waking up for Arthur. He found that he couldn't just go back to being the man who sat in the shadows of his garage. The dirt under his fingernails was no longer from grease and oil. It was from the garden he was building in his backyard. Every time he turned the soil, he thought about Elias. He thought about how a man in a muddy trench thousands of miles away had dreamed of exactly this, the smell of damp earth and the hope of something green growing toward the sun. One Tuesday morning, Arthur heard a truck pull into his driveway. It wasn't the rattling sound of his own old vehicle. He wiped his hands on his trousers and walked around to the front. There stood David, the grandson he had met at the farm. David wasn't empty-handed. In the back of his truck were several flats of vibrant, colorful flowers, lavender, daisies, and small, delicate roses. "I thought you might want some help with that garden," David said, leaning against the tailgate. "My grandmother Clara always said that a garden isn't just for the person who plants it. It's for everyone who walks by and needs a reason to smile." Arthur felt a lump in his throat. They spent the entire day working together. As they dug holes and settled the roots into the ground, David shared more things he had found in the suitcase as he went through it more carefully with his own family. He told Arthur about a small pocket diary Elias had kept. In it, Elias had written a list of things he wanted to do if he ever got home. One of them was help a stranger without asking for anything in return. Arthur stopped digging and looked at his hands. "I think he's finally getting his wish," Arthur whispered. The two men, separated by decades in age, but joined by a single piece of leather luggage, laughed as they worked. For the first time, Arthur's house didn't look like a place where a man was hiding from the world. It looked like a home. The neighbors began to notice. People who had lived on his street for years, people Arthur had ignored or grumbled at, began to stop by. They brought seeds. They brought advice on how to keep the rabbits away. And sometimes they just brought a thermos of coffee and a desire to talk. The most important change, however, occurred on a Sunday afternoon. Arthur's brother Leo pulled into the driveway. He wasn't alone. He brought his daughter and a small, energetic grandson Arthur had never even met. Arthur stood on his porch, feeling a wave of nerves. He realized that the suitcase hadn't just saved Elias's memory, it had saved Arthur's future. Leo walked up the steps and handed Arthur an old framed photograph. It was a picture of the two of them when they were children, standing by a lake with fishing poles. "I found this in the attic," Leo said. "I realized that if an old suitcase could survive all those years, our brotherhood should have survived a few arguments." Arthur took the photo, his eyes misting over. He invited them inside. The house was no longer a tomb of practical things. He had hung the photo of Elias and Clara in a place of honor near the kitchen table. He told the story of the suitcase to his niece and her son. He watched as the little boy touched the brass latches of the suitcase, which David had lent back to Arthur so he could show his family. Arthur realized that stories are like seeds. If you keep them locked in a box in a dark garage, they stay dead. But if you share them, if you plant them in the hearts of others, they grow into something that can change the world. He wasn't just Arthur the mechanic anymore. He was Arthur the storyteller as the sun began to set over his new garden. Arthur sat on his porch with Leo. They watched the kids run through the grass. The air was filled with the scent of the lavender David had brought. Arthur thought about the man at the estate sale who had sold him the suitcase for $5. He wished he could go back and tell that man that he hadn't sold him a box. He had sold him a map back to his own soul. Arthur looked at the suitcase sitting on the porch table. It was empty now, but it felt heavier than ever with the weight of the love and reconciliation it had carried across time. He realized that everyone has a suitcase tucked away somewhere, regret, a memory, or a letter they never sent. The secret to a good life, he decided, was having the courage to open it, before it was too late. He picked up a small stone from the garden and placed it inside the suitcase. A tradition he started to mark the day his family came home. He closed the lid, and the snap of the latches didn't sound like an ending. It sounded like a beginning. Arthur was finally home, and for the first time in his life, he wasn't looking for a bargain. He had already found the most valuable thing in the world, a heart that was wide open. The garden grew taller with every passing week. And as the flowers bloomed, Arthur found that his own life was expanding in ways he had never imagined. He had spent so many years thinking that he was a man who lived alone. But he began to realize that no one is truly alone if they are willing to open their door. The suitcase, though now empty of its original letters, remained a centerpiece in his living room. It was a reminder of the day his heart changed. It became a conversation starter for everyone who visited. One afternoon, a woman from the local historical society knocked on Arthur's door. She had heard rumors about the discovery from the librarian and wanted to know if Arthur would be willing to share the story with the town. Initially, Arthur's old instincts kicked in. He wanted to say no. He wanted to keep his privacy. But then he remembered Elias's face in that old photograph, a young man who had so much to say, but ran out of time to say it. Arthur realized that he wasn't just a keeper of a suitcase. He was a guardian of a legacy. He agreed to speak at the town hall. The night of the presentation, the room was packed. People Arthur had seen at the grocery store for decades, but never spoken to, were sitting in the front row. He felt his hands sweat as he stood behind the podium. He hadn't brought a written speech. Instead, he brought the suitcase. He set it on the table and told the story exactly as it happened. He told them about the dust in the garage, the rusted latches, and the smell of old paper. He told them about the letters to Clara and the broken watch. But mostly he told them about the lesson he had learned. He told the crowd that we often spend our lives collecting things that don't matter, tools, money, gadgets, while the things that truly define us are left to rot in the dark. He talked about his brother Leo, who was sitting in the audience, and how a letter written by a dead soldier had convinced him to pick up the phone. When he finished, the room was silent for a long time. Then, one by one, people began to stand and clap. It wasn't because Arthur was a great speaker. It was because he had touched a chord that exists in everyone. Everyone has someone they haven't called. Everyone has a suitcase they are afraid to open. After the talk, something unexpected happened. People didn't just go home. They stayed and talked to Arthur. A man approached him and confessed that he hadn't spoken to his son in 3 years over a silly disagreement about a car. A woman told him she had a box of her grandmother's old journals in her attic that she had been too afraid to read. But now she was going to go home and open them. Arthur realized that his small act of honesty was creating a ripple effect. The story of Elias was no longer just about the past. It was changing the present for an entire community. Over the next few months, Arthur and David became close friends. They started a project together, using a small portion of Arthur's backyard to build a community garden. They called it the Traveler's Rest. It wasn't just a place for vegetables. It was a place where people could sit on benches and talk. Arthur installed a small weatherproof box at the entrance of the garden. Inside, he put a notebook and a pen. He invited people to write down a memory or a message to someone they loved. Every Sunday, Leo would come over with his grandson. They would help Arthur weed the garden or paint the fence. Arthur's house, once the quietest place on the block, was now filled with the sound of laughter and the clinking of lemonade glasses. Arthur looked at his hands, which were now permanently stained with soil rather than grease. He felt a deep sense of peace. He wasn't the man who was waiting for the end anymore. He was a man who was busy living. One evening, while Arthur was sitting on his porch, he looked at the suitcase. He realized that the leather was looking dry and cracked again. He went into his house, got some oil, and began to carefully rub it into the hide. He treated it with the same care a person might treat a living thing. As he worked, he found a tiny slit in the interior lining that he hadn't noticed before. He reached in with 2 fingers and felt a small, thin piece of metal. He pulled it out. It was a key. It was a small, silver key with a heart-shaped top. Arthur stared at it, his breath hitching. This was the key to the suitcase, the one the man at the estate sale said didn't exist. It had been hidden there the whole time. Arthur realized the irony. He had forced the suitcase open with a screwdriver, but the key had always been part of the journey. It felt like a final message from Elias. It was as if he was saying that the most important things in life aren't always visible at first glance. You have to look deeper. And sometimes, you have to be willing to break things open to find the truth. Arthur didn't need the key now, but he held it tight. He decided he would give it to David the next day. It was the final piece of the puzzle. As the stars came out, Arthur felt a sense of gratitude for that dusty Saturday morning at the estate sale. He had gone looking for a bargain, and he had found his soul. He understood now that life isn't about what you take with you when you leave. It's about what you leave behind for others to find. The suitcase had traveled through a war, across an ocean, and through decades of neglect, just to sit on Arthur's table and tell him that he was loved, and that it was never too late to start over. Arthur leaned back in his chair, listening to the crickets in his garden. He closed his eyes and whispered a thank you to the wind, to the young man in the photograph, and to the woman named Clara who had kept the suitcase safe for all those years. The story was complete, and for the first time in his life, Arthur knew exactly who he was.